The cold in the Missouri Ozarks of 1910 was a living thing. It was a predator that crept down from the ancient forested hills, seeping through the cracks of clapboard homes and settling deep into the bones of anyone foolish enough to be caught in its grasp. For Dr. Alastair Finch, fresh from the relative warmth and scientific enlightenment of St. Louis, the cold was more than just a physical sensation, it was an omen. He clutched the reins of his tired horse, the leather stiff and biting against his gloved hands, and stared up at the silhouette that clawed at the bruised twilight sky. The Blackwood home for foundlings. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a tombstone, a grim monument of fieldstone and dark timber perched precariously on a windswept bluff overlooking the ironically named Mercy Hollow. The letter that had summoned him here was crumpled in his coat pocket, its words a disturbing puzzle of clinical detachment and desperate plea. It spoke of a persistent, incurable malady, a wasting sickness that had claimed every child who entered these walls before they saw their 10th birthday. Every single one. For 2 decades. Alastair, a man of logic and reason, had dismissed it as the tragic but predictable outcome of poverty, malnutrition, and the rampant diseases of the era. But standing there, with the wind howling a mournful dirge through the skeletal trees, a primal unease began to replace his scientific certainty. The building had too few windows, and those it had were like vacant eyes, dark and unblinking. There was no light, no sound of children's laughter, no sign of life at all save for a single, thin plume of gray smoke snaking from a stone chimney. It was a place where hope came to die. And as he dismounted, his boots crunching on the frozen, unforgiving ground, he saw it. Near the crooked gate, almost hidden by a dusting of fresh snow, was a small, freshly turned mound of earth. It was a grave, a child's grave, and it was not the first. The scale of the graveyard was the first thing that truly broke through Dr. Finch's professional composure. It wasn't a neat, orderly plot. It was a scattershot collection of sorrows, a field of small, uneven mounds marked by simple wooden crosses, most of them nameless. Some were so old the wood had rotted away, leaving only a faint depression in the earth as a memorial. He counted. He walked the perimeter, his breath misting in the frigid air, and he counted again. 47. 47 small graves, each a silent testament to a life cut brutally short. The most recent one, the one he'd spotted upon arrival, was marked with a freshly carved plank of wood. It read simply, Thomas, aged 8. The ground was still soft, a dark wound in the snow-covered landscape. A wave of nausea, cold and sharp, washed over him. This wasn't just a tragedy of circumstance, it was a statistical impossibility. Even in the poorest, most disease-ridden slums of the city, a mortality rate of 100% was unheard of. It defied medical explanation, it defied logic, it felt intentional. The front door of the orphanage creaked open, spilling a weak, flickering lantern light onto the porch. A woman stood silhouetted in the doorway, tall and impossibly thin, wrapped in a severe black dress that seemed to drink the light around her. This was matron Elspeth Blackwood. Her face, when she stepped forward, was a mask of hard-won stoicism, her features sharp and angular, as if carved from the very rock of the bluff she lived on. Dr. Finch, she stated, her voice as crisp and cold as the air. It was not a question. You are late, the boy is already with his maker. There was no grief in her tone, only a chilling finality. She looked past him, her gaze lingering on the field of tiny graves with an expression he couldn't decipher. It wasn't sorrow, nor was it malice. It was something else entirely, something ancient and unsettling, like a secret she had carried for so long it had become part of her soul. The macabre reality of his task began to settle upon him. He hadn't come here to treat a sickness, he had come to confront a curse. Matron Blackwood led him inside, and the cold seemed to follow them, clinging to the shadows in the corners of the cavernous main hall. The air was thick with the scent of boiled cabbage, lye soap, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet that made the hairs on Alastair's arms stand on end. The interior was as barren and unforgiving as the landscape outside. The floorboards were scrubbed raw, the walls devoid of any decoration, the furniture sparse and utilitarian. There were no toys, no drawings, no splashes of color, none of the chaotic clutter that signaled the presence of children. It felt less like an orphanage and more like a workhouse, a place of grim purpose and silent suffering. In the corner, huddled together on a long wooden bench near a meager fire, were the remaining children. There were only 4 of them. They were small for their ages, with pale, translucent skin and large, haunted eyes that followed his every move. They didn't whisper or fidget. They sat unnervingly still, their hands folded in their laps like porcelain dolls arranged for display. The little girl with straw-colored hair, no older than 6, coughed a dry, rattling cough that echoed in the oppressive silence. Matron Blackwood didn't so much as glance in her direction. The sickness begins in the lungs, she said, her voice a flat monotone. Then comes the fever and the wasting. They simply fade. The Lord's will is not for us to question, Doctor. Alastair, a man of science, felt an immediate, visceral rejection of her fatalism. He knelt down, attempting a warm smile for the children. Hello there, he said gently. I'm Dr. Finch. I'm here to help you feel better. The children didn't respond. They simply stared, their gazes empty, their faces devoid of the natural curiosity or shyness he expected. It was as if their spirits had been systematically hollowed out, leaving only these fragile, silent shells. The little girl with the cough flinched when he moved closer, her eyes darting towards the matron with a flash of pure terror. In that single, unguarded moment, Alastair understood. These children were not just sick. They were afraid. terrified, not of a disease but of the very woman who was supposed to be their protector. The local town, if one could call it that, was a handful of buildings named Havenwood, huddled in the valley below the orphanage. It was a place steeped in suspicion and folklore, where the modern world of 1910 had yet to fully penetrate the thick woods and thicker superstitions. The sheriff, a man named Brody with a weathered face and weary eyes, met Alistair at the town's only saloon. He listened to the doctor's frantic concerns with a practiced patience, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. The Blackwood place, Brody sighed, his gaze drifting to the window towards the bluff that was now invisible in the encroaching darkness. Folks around here don't go up there, haven't for years. He explained that Elspeth Blackwood had arrived 2 decades prior, a stern, religious woman from back east with funding from some anonymous church benefactor. She had purchased the old, abandoned mineral lodge on the bluff, a place the locals already considered sour ground, and converted it into her orphanage. At first, the town had been grateful. The home took in the unwanted, the children of tragedy and misfortune, but then the dying started. Every year another 1 or 2, Brody said, his voice low, always before they're old enough to rightly work a field or speak their mind. Matron Blackwood comes down, files a death certificate, always winter lung or consumption, and buries them herself. It's all orderly. Alistair slammed his hand on the sticky table. Orderly, sheriff, it's a massacre. In any other place there would be a massive investigation. Brody took a slow drink. This ain't any other place, son. This is the Ozarks. We mind our own. Besides, he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to conspiratorial whisper. The stories about that bluff go way back, long before the matron. They say the earth there is hungry, that it needs to be fed. Old tales of strange symbols found in the caves, of people who went into those woods and came out changed, or didn't come out at all. Alistair felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He was a man of science, of observable facts. But here, in the dim, lantern-lit saloon, surrounded by the shadows of ancient fears, the line between medicine and the macabre was beginning to blur into a horrifying, indistinguishable gray. The next morning, Alistair demanded to see the orphanage's records. To his surprise, Matron Blackwood complied without protest, leading him to a small, cold office where a single, massive letter sat upon a wooden desk. It was bound in dark, cracked leather, and its pages were filled with her meticulous, spidery script. Every child who had ever passed through the doors of the Blackwood home was accounted for. Name, date of arrival, age, and in a final, stark column, a date of departure. Without exception, this date was followed by the word deceased. Alistair's finger traced the lines, a chronicle of lost lives. John, aged 7, Mary, aged 9, Samuel, aged 8, dozens of names, a litany of the dead. The causes of death were monotonously consistent: pneumonia, influenza, consumption, plausible illnesses, but the pattern was deeply disturbing. No child had ever been adopted. No child had ever run away and been found. No child had ever survived to see their 10th year. It was a perfect, unbroken record of death. As you can see, doctor, the matron's voice cut through his thoughts from the doorway, we have been besieged by misfortune. God has tested this house with relentless sorrow. Her eyes were fixed on the ledger, and again he saw that same unreadable expression. It wasn't piety, it was satisfaction, as if the ledger was not a record of failure but of successful, completed tasks. He began to cross-reference the names with the graves outside. He found a discrepancy. There were names in the book for whom there was no corresponding cross in the graveyard. And stranger still, there were several graves so old they predated the matron's arrival by decades, their markers long gone, their presence known only to the land itself. When he questioned her about it, a flicker of something, annoyance, anger, crossed her face for the first time. The earth is poor here, the winters are harsh, wood rots. We do what we can to honor the departed, but memory fades, doctor, the land forgets. But Alistair didn't believe the land forgot. He was beginning to suspect that it remembered all too well, and that the matron was merely the latest caretaker of a much older, much more horrifying tradition. Days turned into a week, and Alistair found himself trapped in a cycle of dread and frustration. He examined the remaining 4 children daily. They were all underweight, anemic, and listless. Their symptoms were consistent with chronic malnutrition, but there was something else, a deeper malaise that his medical books couldn't explain. He tried to win their trust, bringing them small gifts he'd purchased in Havenwood, a brightly colored ribbon, a handful of horehound candies. They would accept them with trembling hands, their eyes always darting to the ever-watchful matron Blackwood. They would never keep the gifts, which he would later find discarded in the fire grate or half buried in the dirt outside. It was as if any small joy, any token of individuality was forbidden. One evening he managed to speak with the little girl with the cough, whose name he learned was Sarah. He found her alone in the drafty dormitory, staring out the window at the darkening woods. "What do you see out there, Sarah?" he asked softly, keeping his distance. She didn't turn around. Her voice, when it came, was a fragile whisper, barely audible over the wind. "The shadow man," she breathed. "He comes when someone is going to get the sickness." Alistair felt a prickle of unease. "The shadow man? Who is that? Is it someone from the town?" She finally turned to look at him, her pale blue eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed ancient. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "He's not a man. He comes from the trees. He's tall and broken. He walks with a limp. The matron lets him in. He comes to the bedside and he watches." Before he could ask another question, the heavy footsteps of Matron Blackwood echoed in the hall, and Sarah visibly shrank, her face shutting down completely. She scurried back to her cot and turned her face to the wall, a silent, trembling statue. A child's fantasy, a fever dream born of sickness and fear. Alistair wanted to believe that. But the sheer, unadulterated terror in her eyes told him otherwise. She had seen something, and whatever it was part of the horrifying, forbidden secret kept within these cold stone walls. Alistair brought Sarah's story to Sheriff Brody, expecting to be met with skepticism. Instead, the weary lawman's face grew taut. He led Alistair to the back of his small office, to a dusty cabinet filled with old town records and forgotten files. He pulled out a thin, brittle folder yellowed with age. The file was labeled Hale Creek Disappearances, 1875. Long before the orphanage was built, Brody began, his voice low. That bluff was just a wild piece of land. People avoided it. There was a small settlement, more of a camp really, down in the hollow. Loggers and their families. One winter, people started vanishing. First a trapper, then a whole family. A child from the camp claimed he saw a crooked man walking in the woods near their cabin the night his sister went missing. Said the man was tall as two men and dragged one leg behind him. Brody opened the folder. Inside was a single, crude drawing, presumably made by the child witness. It depicted a stick figure, grotesquely elongated, with one leg bent at an impossible angle. It was a chillingly accurate description of what Sarah had called the Shadow Man. They found no bodies, Brody continued. No tracks, no signs of a struggle. It was like the earth just opened up and swallowed them. The rest of the settlers abandoned the place, said the whole hollow was cursed. That's when folks started calling it Mercy Hollow, praying for mercy for anyone lost in it. Land sat empty for 30 years, until Elspeth Blackwood arrived and decided it was the perfect place to build a home for children. The connection was undeniable, a dark thread of folklore weaving its way into the fabric of his modern medical investigation. The wasting sickness, the matron's strange detachment, the children's terror, and now a local legend of a vanishing entity. It was all connected. The orphanage hadn't brought a curse to this land. It had been built directly on top of one. A long-dormant horror had been reawakened, and the children were its unwilling sacrifice. Alistair's medical supplies were running low, a fact he used as a pretext to ride back to St. Louis. He needed distance, but more importantly, he needed resources beyond the reach of Havenwood. He took the orphanage's ledger with him, a risky move he justified as necessary for further study. In the city, he didn't go to a medical supply house. He went to the Central Archives, a vast, dusty library of public records. He spent 2 days poring over birth certificates, census data, and church records, cross-referencing the names from Matron Blackwood's grim chronicle. A horrifying pattern began to emerge. Many of the children listed in the ledger simply didn't exist outside of it. There were no birth records, no baptismal certificates, no trace that they had ever been born to anyone. They were phantoms, names conjured from thin air and entered into a book of the dead. Others, a smaller number, did have records. They were the children of the desperate and the destitute from surrounding counties, officially signed over to the Blackwood home. But their paper trails ended abruptly the moment they entered the matron's care. It was as if the orphanage were a black hole, systematically erasing these children from the world. The most disturbing discovery came when he investigated Elspeth Blackwood herself. He found her name connected to a small, obscure religious sect that had been branded as heretical and disbanded years ago in Pennsylvania. The Disciples of the Eternal Bloom, they called themselves. Their doctrine was a banned, twisted fusion of Christian piety and ancient pre-Christian folk rituals. They believed that the soul was a tangible essence that reached its purest, most potent state in a child just before the age of knowing, which their texts defined as the 10th year of life. They believed this essence, if properly harvested, could be used to. The records were unclear. The sect's writings were confiscated and burned. The official reports spoke of macabre rituals and forbidden practices. Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The 10th birthday wasn't a tragic coincidence. It was a deadline. Armed with this new, terrifying knowledge, Alistair returned to the Ozarks. The cold seemed even more biting now, the landscape more menacing. The fiction of a mysterious illness had been stripped away, replaced by the chilling certainty of a systematic, ritualistic evil. When he presented his findings to Sheriff Brody, the lawman's face, usually a mask of weary resignation, hardened into cold fury. The folklore was no longer just stories, it was a cover for something real, something human and monstrous. A cult, Brody breathed, staring at the doctor's notes. She's not just letting them die, she's harvesting them. The word hung in the air between them, grotesque and unbelievable. The problem was proof. They had a century-old legend, a defunct religious sect, and a ledger full of ghost names. It was enough to curdle the blood, but it wasn't enough to convict a woman who presented herself as a pious servant of God. They needed something tangible, something from one of the graves. An exhumation was illegal, risky, and deeply taboo in a community like Havenwood, but they both knew it was their only choice. Under the cloak of a moonless, starless night, with a bitter wind tearing at their coats, Alistair and Brody took a pair of shovels to the orphanage graveyard. They chose the most recent grave, that of the boy Thomas. The frozen ground fought them for every inch, the rhythmic scrape and thud of their tools sounding unnaturally loud in the dead silence. Alistair's hands, the hands of a surgeon, felt clumsy and profane as he dug into the consecrated earth. Every shovelful of dirt felt like a transgression. But the thought of the 4 remaining children, silent and terrified inside that stone fortress, drove him on. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Brody's shovel struck wood with a hollow thud. The sound echoed in the night, a coffin's knock from the other side of the grave. They had found it. Now came the most horrifying part, opening it. The cheap pine lid of the coffin groaned in protest as Brody pried it open with the edge of his shovel. Alistair held the lantern high, his hand trembling, steeling himself for the grim sight of the boy's body. The lantern light fell inside, and they both recoiled, not in horror but in utter staggering confusion. The coffin was empty. Well, not entirely empty. It was filled to the brim with large, heavy fieldstones, their weight meant to mimic that of a small body. Tucked amongst the stones was a small, crudely sewn burlap doll, its button eyes staring up at them with a blank, mocking expression. They stood in stunned silence, the wind whipping around them, the open, empty grave at their feet. The truth was suddenly so much worse than they had imagined. Matron Blackwood hadn't just been letting the children die and burying them. She was staging the burials. The meticulously kept ledger, the death certificates, the field of 47 crosses, it was all an elaborate, horrifying theater. A performance designed to satisfy the inquiries of a world she wanted to keep at a distance. If you are unsettled by the dark secrets we're unearthing from the forgotten corners of history, consider subscribing to our channel. The truths we find are often far more disturbing than any legend, and the mystery of the Blackwood home is only just beginning its descent into the macabre. The question that now screamed in Alistair's mind was deafening. If the children weren't in the graves, where were they? What unspeakable thing was happening to them that was worse than death and required such a monstrous deception? The empty coffin wasn't an ending. It was a doorway to a new, even more terrifying level of the mystery. They filled the grave back in, working with a frantic, desperate energy, trying to erase any sign of their desecration before the first light of dawn. The burlap doll, a chilling token of the matron's deception, Alistair secreted away in his medical bag. It felt cold to the touch, imbued with the malice of its creator. Back in the relative safety of Brody's office, the weight of their discovery settled upon them. This was no longer just a cold case. It was an active, ongoing crime of unimaginable cruelty. The 4 children still in that house were not just destined to die, they were destined to vanish. The Springs, Brody said suddenly, his voice raspy. He walked to a large hand-drawn map of the county that hung on his wall. The bluff is riddled with them. Old limestone caves, underground rivers, the water that comes out at Hale Creek starts up there on her land. The implication was monstrous. A body committed to the flowing water of an underground spring would be carried deep into the earth, into a labyrinth of inaccessible caves, eventually depositing its remains miles away, if at all. It was the perfect, untraceable method of disposal. A watery, unmarked grave from which no secrets could ever be exhumed. The Shadow Man legend took on a new, horrific meaning. Was it a story concocted to explain the disappearances? Or was it a real person, an accomplice, who helped the matron carry out her grim work, using the folklore as a shield? Alistair thought of little Sarah, her face pale in the dormitory gloom, speaking of the matron letting the figure inside. It wasn't a ghost. It was a collaborator, a human monster hiding behind a supernatural mask. They were no longer dealing with a lone, disturbed woman. They were dealing with a conspiracy. Alistair knew he had to get back inside the orphanage, but his relationship with Matron Blackwood was already strained to the breaking point. His overt investigation had made her wary. He needed a new approach. He decided to play her game. The next day he approached her not as a doctor, but as a defeated man of science. He spoke of the town's stubborn superstitions, of the sickness defying all modern medical explanation. He feigned a crisis of faith in his own profession. "Perhaps you are right, matron," he said, forcing a look of weary resignation. "Perhaps some things are simply in God's hands beyond our understanding." He watched her face carefully for any reaction. A flicker of triumph, a glint of condescension appeared in her eyes. She believed she had broken him, bent his worldly knowledge to her divine will. The ruse worked, her guard lowered just slightly. She began to speak more freely of her philosophy, a twisted dogma of purity and release. "The world of man is a crucible of sin and suffering, doctor," she preached, her voice taking on a fervent, almost hypnotic cadence. "To linger in it is to become tarnished. These children, they are the purest of God's creatures. To release them before the world can stain their souls, it is not a tragedy. It is the ultimate act of mercy." It was the doctrine of the eternal bloom, cloaked in the language of mainstream faith. Alistair had to fight the urge to physically recoil from her. He was standing in the presence of a monster who truly believed her monstrosities were acts of love. Under the guise of documenting the incurable sickness, he requested access to the entire building, including the cellar and the small, disused chapel attached to the main house. Thinking him a convert to her fatalistic worldview, she granted it. He was now free to search for the true, horrifying heart of the Blackwood home. The orphanage was a maze of cold rooms and dark corridors, each one feeling more oppressive than the last. He started in the cellar. It was damp and smelled of earth and rotting potatoes, but it contained nothing more sinister than food stores and firewood. He moved through the kitchen, the dormitories, the washroom, finding nothing out of the ordinary, save for the pervasive sense of sorrow and fear that clung to the very walls. His last hope was the chapel. It was a small, austere room at the far end of the building, thick with dust from disuse. A few rough-hewn pews faced a simple wooden altar. A large, faded tapestry depicting a generic biblical scene hung on the wall behind it. It seemed like another dead end. Disheartened, Alistair ran a hand along the cold stone wall. His fingers brushed against the edge of the tapestry. On a hunch, he pulled it aside. Behind it was not stone but a heavy, dark wooden door, its iron hinges rusted and stiff. It was clearly not part of the original structure, it had been added later. There was no handle, only a small, oddly shaped keyhole. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he had found it. This was the place where the matron's true faith was practiced. He examined the keyhole. It was not for a normal key. It was a specific, almost symbolic shape, like a blooming flower with a thorn stem. A terrible realization dawned on him. He had seen the shape before. It was subtly carved into the headboard of the matron's own bed, which he had glimpsed through her open door. It must have been the symbol of her cult. The key to this forbidden room was likely in her personal quarters, the one place he could not go without arousing immediate suspicion. He had found the lock, but the key remained tantalizingly, dangerously out of reach. Alistair searched for the hidden secrets of the house. Another of the children, a quiet boy named Daniel, began to show the telltale signs of the wasting sickness. It started with a dry cough, the same sound he had heard from little Sarah. Then came the low-grade fever and a profound lethargy. Alistair watched in horror as the boy's already pale skin seemed to grow more translucent by the day. He tried to intervene, to administer the tonics and medicines from his bag, but Matron Blackwood forbade it. "You yourself agreed, doctor," she said, her voice laced with cold victory. "His fate is in the hands of a higher power now. Your chemicals will only interfere with his peaceful transition." She isolated Daniel in a small, windowless room at the back of the orphanage, a place the other children called the waiting room. She claimed it was for his own comfort, to allow him to rest quietly. But Alistair knew it was a quarantine of a different sort. It wasn't to prevent the spread of a disease. It was to prepare the subject for the final ritual. He became obsessed, watching the matron's every move, hopping to find the key to the hidden room. He observed her daily routine, a rigid, unchanging schedule of chores, prayers, and silent meals. She wore a simple silver locket around her neck at all times, a piece of jewelry that seemed oddly sentimental for such a severe woman. He began to wonder if the key was not a key at all. Perhaps it was the locket itself, its shape corresponding to the strange lock. His desperation grew with each passing day as Daniel's condition worsened. The boy was fatting, just as the matron had predicted, just as dozens of children had before him. Alistair felt like a man watching a slow, deliberate murder, utterly powerless to stop it. Time was running out, not just for Daniel, but for them all. The macabre clock of the Blackwood home was ticking towards another grim deadline. The opportunity Alistair had been waiting for came during a sudden, violent thunderstorm that rolled through the hollow, shaking the old house to its foundations. A bolt of lightning struck a massive oak tree near the graveyard, setting it ablaze. The matron, her composure finally broken by a primal fear of fire, rushed outside with buckets, screaming for the older children to help. It was a chaotic, desperate scene, and it provided the perfect cover. With the matron distracted, Alistair slipped into her private quarters. The room was as stark and joyless as the rest of the house. A simple bed, a washstand, a locked wardrobe. There was no time for a thorough search. He went straight for the locket he had seen her place on her nightstand before retiring each night. He snatched it, his heart pounding in his chest. It was heavier than it looked. With trembling fingers, he worked at the clasp. It opened, but not to reveal a space for a tiny portrait. Instead, the two halves of the locket folded outwards, reshaping into a bizarre, flower-shaped key, the symbol of the eternal bloom. He raced back to the chapel, the stolen key clutched in his sweaty palm. The sound of the storm and the crackling fire outside masked his movements. He pushed the key into the strange lock behind the tapestry. It slid in with a sickening, oily click. He turned it. The heavy tumblers inside the lock groaned, and the hidden door swung inward, revealing a flight of steep, narrow stone steps descending into absolute darkness. A wave of musty, cold air, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, incense and decay, rose up to meet him. He lit his lantern, took a deep breath, and began his descent into the forbidden heart of the orphanage. He knew that whatever he found below, it would be the proof he needed. It would also be a horror from which he might never recover. The stone steps led down into a small, circular chamber carved directly from the bedrock beneath the orphanage. The air was unnaturally cold and still. The lantern light pushed back the oppressive darkness, revealing walls covered in disturbing faded murals. They were not Christian in nature. They depicted grotesque scenes of emaciated, stick-like figures offering up glowing objects, souls, he realized with a jolt, to a looming, shadowy entity with crooked limbs, the Shadow Man. In the center of the room was a stone altar, much like the one in the chapel above, but this one was stained with dark, rust-colored patches that his medical eye knew was old blood. On the altar lay a collection of macabre instruments, a silver chalice, an obsidian knife with a jagged edge, and several glass vials containing strange, viscous liquids. But the most horrifying discovery was the books. Piled on a stone ledge were several leather-bound journals, all filled with Matron Blackwood's cramped, precise handwriting. These were not orphanage records. These were the sacred texts, the procedural manuals for her hideous rituals. Alistair opened one at random. The pages were filled with detailed anatomical drawings of children, charts aligning their decline with lunar cycles, and recipes for herbal concoctions. He found the formula for the wasting sickness. It was a slow-acting poison, a careful blend of native and non-native plants, including the very fibers he suspected he would find if he had a proper lab, designed to mimic the symptoms of consumption, to slowly break down the body while, according to the text, purifying the vessel for the final bloom. He had found the source of the curse. It wasn't a disease, a legend, or an act of God. It was a calculated, meticulously planned series of poisonings, a production line of death orchestrated by the woman upstairs. The cold case had just become a confession. Flipping through the journals, his blood running cold, Alistair uncovered the full, horrifying scope of the cult's beliefs. The disciples of the Eternal Bloom did not worship God or any known devil. They worshipped the land itself, or rather an entity they believed slumbered within it, the same entity the old legends called the Shadow Man or the Crooked Man. They saw it as a primordial being of immense power, a being that fed on pure life essence. The ritual, which they called the unburdening, was not about achieving immortality for themselves, but about feeding this entity to keep it dormant and, in their twisted view, to keep the world in balance. The children were the offering. The journals described the process in chilling detail. The wasting sickness was the preparation, weakening the child's physical hold on their spirit. The final act took place on the night of a new moon, when the veil between worlds was thinnest. The child, barely conscious from the poison, would be brought down to this chamber. The ceremony involved chanting, the burning of specific herbs, and a final, fatal act at the moment of release. The obsidian knife, the chalice. Alistair didn't need to read the specifics to understand their gruesome purpose. The final entry in the most recent journal was dated the previous day. It read, Daniel, age 8, the vessel is prepared, the moon is right, the unburdening is nigh. You will feed the Ancient One and the bloom will be preserved. The ritual was happening tonight, the storm, the fire, it was all a distraction. As he stood there, frozen in horror, he heard a faint sound from deeper within the chamber. A low, rhythmic chanting. It wasn't coming from upstairs. He raised his lantern and saw another opening, a dark, narrow tunnel leading away from the ritual chamber, deeper into the earth. The chanting was coming from down there. He had to find Brody. He had to stop this. But a morbid, dreadful curiosity pulled him forward. He had to see the end of it. He had to witness the heart of this darkness. Following the sound of the chanting, Alistair moved through the narrow tunnel, which soon opened into a vast natural cavern. The air grew colder, heavy with the sound of rushing water. In the center of the cavern, a deep, dark spring bubbled up from the earth, its water black as ink, before flowing into a chasm that disappeared into the planet's depths. This was the place Brody had spoken of, the source of Hale Creek, the children's final, unmarked grave. And there, on the edge of the spring, was a scene from a nightmare. Matron Blackwood was not alone. With her was a man impossibly tall and gaunt, dressed in dark, ragged clothes. He moved with a strange, lurching gait, one of his legs dragging uselessly behind him. The Shadow Man, he was real. A man, not a spirit, whose deformity had been woven into local legend, providing the perfect disguise for his monstrous activities. They stood over a small, frail figure lying on a flat rock at the water's edge. It was Daniel, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. He was wrapped in a white sheet, a sacrificial lamb. The matron was chanting in a language Alistair didn't recognize, her voice echoing unnaturally in the vast space. The tall man held the obsidian knife, its edge glinting in the faint light of a few strategically placed lanterns. Alistair's mind screamed. This was it, the culmination of 2 decades of murder. The horrifying secret at the heart of the orphanage. He was a doctor, a man sworn to preserve life, and he was witnessing the prelude to human sacrifice. Every instinct told him to run, to get the sheriff, to bring the law down on this unholy place. But he was paralyzed, a spectator in a theater of the macabre, watching a forbidden history unfold before his very eyes. The matron raised her hands, her chanting reaching a crescendo. The tall man raised the knife. Alistair knew he had only seconds to act. A surge of adrenaline, potent and pure, shattered Alistair's paralysis. He was no lawman, no hero, but he could not stand by and watch a child be murdered. He let out a furious, guttural yell, a sound of pure rage that ripped through the cavern and broke the spell of the ritual. Stop! The matron and her grotesque accomplice spun around, their faces masks of shock and disbelief. For a moment they were frozen, caught completely off guard. In that moment, Alistair did the only thing he could think of. He grabbed a loose rock from the cavern floor and hurled it with all his strength, not at them, but at one of the lanterns perched precariously on a rock shelf above them. The rock struck true. The lantern shattered, spilling burning oil down the cavern wall. Flames erupted, casting dancing, monstrous shadows across the chamber. The tall man flinched back from the sudden fire, his concentration broken. It was the opening Alistair needed. He charged forward, not towards the armed man, but towards Daniel. He scooped the boy's feather-light body into his arms and scrambled back towards the tunnel, his heart hammering against his ribs. The matron shrieked, a sound of inhuman fury and frustration. The vessel, you defile the offering. The tall man recovered quickly, his shock turning to rage. He started after Alistair, his lurching gait surprisingly fast. The tunnel was narrow, a bottleneck. Alistair knew he would never make it back up the stairs carrying the child before the man caught him. He was trapped. The fire was spreading, smoke beginning to fill the cavern. He could hear the man's heavy, uneven footsteps closing in behind him, a slow, relentless drumbeat of doom. He had saved the boy from the knife, only to lead them both to a different, perhaps even more terrifying end. Just as the Shadow Man reached the entrance to the tunnel, his massive frame blocking the only escape, a new sound echoed from behind Alistair, the deafening boom of a shotgun. The tall man staggered, a spray of rock chips exploding from the tunnel wall next to his head. He bellowed in pain and surprise, clutching his shoulder. Sheriff Brody stood at the top of the stairs in the ritual chamber, his shotgun smoking, his face grim as death. "It's over, Elspeth," he yelled, his voice carrying over the crackle of the flames. "The law has come to Mercy Hollow." The sight of the sheriff and his weapon sent the matron into a frenzy. She was no longer a pious, stoic woman, she was a cornered animal. She grabbed the obsidian knife from the altar rock and lunged not at Brody but at the chasm where the spring water disappeared into the earth. "He will not be starved," she screamed, her eyes wild. "The Ancient One must feed." With a final, chilling cry, she leaped into the abyss, disappearing into the churning black water. It was a shocking, absolute end. She chose to feed herself to her god rather than face the justice of men. The tall man, seeing his mistress gone and the law before him, made a different choice. He turned and limped deeper into the cave systems, away from the fire and the spring, vanishing into a darkness so complete that it seemed to swallow him whole. Brody didn't fire again. "Let the caves have him," he muttered, his voice heavy. "He'll never find his way out." Alistair, clutching the semi-conscious Daniel, scrambled up the steps into the ritual room, which was now thick with smoke. They had the boy, they had the journal, they had stopped the sacrifice, but the victory felt hollow. The matron was gone, her accomplice vanished, and the full, horrifying truth of their forbidden religion had been swallowed by the earth, leaving behind only questions and the lingering stench of evil. They carried Daniel out of the burning orphanage and into the clean, cold night air. The thunderstorm had passed and the stars were out, indifferent witnesses to the horrors below. Alistair immediately set to work on the boy, administering what aid he could from his medical bag. The child was severely dehydrated and suffering from the effects of the poison, but his pulse was steady if weak. He was alive, he had a chance. Back in town, as dawn broke, Havenwood awoke to the sight of a pillar of smoke rising from the bluff. The orphanage was a raging inferno. Brody, to avoid a panic and the inevitable contamination of a crime scene, told the townsfolk that a lightning strike had started the fire. It was a plausible lie, one they readily accepted. No one mourned the loss of the Blackwood home. They seemed relieved, as if a blight had finally been purged from their land. The other 3 children, including Sarah, were found huddled together in the root cellar, where they had hidden from the storm and the fire. They were scared and weak, but physically unharmed. They were brought to town and taken in by the pastor's wife, their silence a testament to the unspeakable trauma they had endured. Alistair stayed by Daniel's side for 3 days, flushing the poison from his system, forcing broth and water between his cracked lips. Slowly, miraculously, the boy began to recover. The wasting sickness, when confronted with actual medicine and care, proved to be treatable. It was a simple, damning confirmation of the matron's crimes. She had not been fighting a disease, she had been meticulously administering one. The evil was not supernatural, it was chillingly, horrifyingly human. In the smoldering ruins of the orphanage, Sheriff Brody and his deputies made a series of grim discoveries that confirmed the tales in the matron's journals. They found the hidden entrance to the chapel's secret room, the stone stairs leading down into the earth. The ritual chamber and the cavern beyond were now inaccessible, the tunnel having collapsed in the fire, but the journals Alistair had saved were proof enough. They also found the matron's locked wardrobe in the ashes of her room. Prying it open, they found it filled not with clothes, but with dozens of small, personal items: a single child's shoe, a worn wooden toy soldier, a girl's hair ribbon, a pocket knife, trophies, mementos from each of the children she had unburdened. It was a horrifying collection, a private museum of her atrocities. This discovery was, for many, even more disturbing than the ritual sacrifice. It spoke to a deep, possessive sickness, a need to hold on to a piece of the lives she had systematically extinguished. Each item was a ghost, a tangible remnant of a child who had been erased from the world. The investigation into the accomplice, the Shadow Man, yielded little. Brody organized a search of the cave systems, but it was a fool's errand. The labyrinth was vast, unmapped, and treacherous. The man was never found. He, like the matron, had been claimed by the darkness of the bluff, becoming a true ghost, a permanent fixture in the local folklore he had once exploited. He was a loose end in a case that was full of them, a disturbing reminder that not all monsters are brought to justice. The 4 surviving children presented the greatest challenge. They were the only living witnesses, yet they could not speak of what they had seen. Trauma had rendered them mute, not physically but emotionally. When questioned gently by Alistair or the pastor's wife, their eyes would glaze over and they would retreat into the silent, protected fortress of their own minds. Sarah, the girl who had spoken of the Shadow Man, was the most withdrawn. She would spend hours staring into space, sometimes tracing invisible patterns in the air. Alistair realized with a pang of guilt and horror that the children's silence had been their only shield. To speak of the horrors, to acknowledge them, was to invite the attention of the matron, and so they had learned to bury it all, to become as still and silent as the little graves on the hill. Their recovery would be a long, arduous process, perhaps a lifelong one. The physical poison could be flushed from their bodies, but the poison in their minds was a different matter entirely. They were sent to a proper state-run institution in St. Louis, a place with doctors and counselors who, it was hoped, could begin to heal their fractured spirits. But the truth was, no one knew how to treat children who had lived in the shadow of a macabre cult, who had watched their friends sicken and disappear one by one. The Blackwood orphans, as they came to be known, carried the curse of Mercy Hollow with them, a silent, invisible burden that would follow them for the rest of their days. They were the last victims of a cold case that was, in a tragic sense, still very much alive. The journals were a puzzle. Much of them were written in a strange cipher, a mix of Latin, archaic English, and the bizarre symbols of the eternal bloom. Alastair, with the help of a linguistics professor from Washington University, spent months trying to decipher the full text. What they managed to translate painted an even more disturbing picture of the cult. It was older and more widespread than he had imagined. The Blackwood home was not an isolated cell, it was one of many. The journals spoke of other gardens, other caretakers in remote, forgotten places across the country, all practicing the same rituals, all unburdening the young to feed their slumbering gods. The anonymous church benefactor who had funded the orphanage was likely part of this hidden network. It was a chilling revelation. Elspeth Blackwood was not the source of the evil, but merely a loyal and perhaps particularly zealous foot soldier in a much larger secret war. The cult was patient, operating on a timescale of centuries, not years. The disappearance of one caretaker was a setback, but it would not stop their great work. This thought was more terrifying to Alastair than any single act of murder. The evil he had stumbled upon in the Ozarks was not contained. It had roots deep and wide, and it was still out there, hidden beneath a veneer of piety and charity, tending its other gardens, harvesting its blooms. The cold case of the Blackwood home was just one chapter in a much larger, unwritten book of horrors. The official report on the Blackwood home for foundlings was a masterpiece of sanitization. Sheriff Brody, in consultation with state officials, made the decision to bury the most disturbing aspects of the case. The public was told that Matron Blackwood and an unnamed male accomplice were responsible for the deaths of several children through neglect and malnutrition, and that they had perished in the fire that destroyed the orphanage. The story of the cult, the ritual sacrifices, the underground chamber, all of it was stricken from the record. It was deemed too fantastic, too horrifying for public consumption. It would create a national panic, a witch hunt that would do more harm than good. The journals were sealed and locked away in a state evidence vault, banned from public view, their secrets deemed too dangerous. What Finch and Brody uncovered beneath that orphanage floor would rewrite the history of Havenwood, but it was a history that would never be told. It's a descent into a darkness that authorities decided the world was not ready to see. The truth was sacrificed for the sake of order, and so the story of Mercy Hollow was officially closed. The case was solved, the perpetrators brought to a form of justice, the surviving victims relocated. The world moved on. But for Alastair Finch and Sheriff Brody, the case would never be closed. They knew the truth. They knew that the fire had not purged the evil, it had merely cauterized one of its many wounds. They were left to live with the knowledge of a vast, hidden malevolence, a secret they were forced to carry to their own graves. Dr. Alastair Finch never returned to his promising career in St. Louis. The things he had seen in Mercy Hollow had fundamentally changed him. He could no longer view the world through the clear, rational lens of science. He had looked into the abyss, and its darkness had stained his soul. He abandoned his practice and dedicated his life to a strange, obsessive new pursuit. He used the partially decoded journals as a roadmap, spending the rest of his years traveling the country, seeking out other remote, isolated institutions that fit the profile of a garden. He became a drifter, a Cassandra warning of a threat no one else could see. He sent letters to law enforcement agencies, to newspapers, to church leaders, describing a pattern of unexplained child mortality and obscure religious sects. His warnings were dismissed as the ravings of a madman, the paranoid delusions of a doctor who had witnessed one terrible tragedy and now saw its ghost around every corner. He was a man haunted by a truth he could never prove, a truth the world refused to believe. He was fighting a secret war alone, and it was a war that would ultimately consume him. The cold case of the Blackwood home had set him on a dark, lonely path, a crusade against a phantom enemy whose existence was known only to him and a handful of sealed, forbidden documents. Sheriff Brody retired a few years after the fire. He was a good man who had been confronted with an evil so profound it shattered his simple Ozark worldview of right and wrong. He never spoke of the case again, not to his wife, not to his deputies, not even to Alastair in their infrequent cryptic correspondences. But the town of Havenwood remembered, not the truth, but the legend. The story of the orphanage was absorbed into the local folklore, becoming another cautionary tale whispered around winter fires. They said the bluff was haunted now, not just by the old spirits of the hollow, but by the vengeful ghosts of the children and the damned soul of the matron herself. Locals reported strange lights on the bluff on moonless nights, the faint sound of a woman chanting on the wind, and the terrifying sight of a tall, crooked man limping at the edge of the woods. The story became a tool for parents to frighten their children into obedience. Be good, or the matron from the hill will come for you. The horror was domesticated, turned into a spooky story, its true macabre teeth filed down into a harmless piece of local color. The town chose to forget the truth, to bury it under a comforting layer of superstition, because the reality of what happened in their backyard was simply too much for the human heart to bear. The site of the orphanage became forbidden ground, a blackened scar on the landscape that no one dared to disturb. Years later, in the late 1930s, a team of geologists surveying the area for potential dam sites stumbled upon the cave systems on the bluff. Unaware of the land's dark history, they explored the entrance near Hale Creek. Deep within the earth, in a chamber far from the spring, they found a human skeleton. It was the skeleton of a tall man, his bones twisted by what appeared to be an old, badly healed leg injury. Among the remains, they found the rusted remnants of a large, crude knife. The Shadow Man had been found at last. He had not escaped. The caves had indeed claimed him, just as Brody had predicted. He had died alone in the darkness, a fitting end for a creature who thrived in it. But this discovery only deepened the mystery. Who was he? Where did he come from? The journals had never given him a name, referring to him only as the gardener or the shepherd. He was a ghost even in the cult's own records. His identity remained a permanent blank, another unanswered question in a case file overflowing with them. His bones were quietly interred in an unmarked pauper's grave, his role in the century's most disturbing cold case unknown to anyone but a retired sheriff and a disgraced doctor, both of whom were now old men, haunted by the secrets they kept. What of the surviving children? Their story is perhaps the most tragic part of this macabre tale. Official records show that of the 4 survivors, none lived what could be called a normal life. They were moved from institution to institution, their profound psychological trauma making them difficult to place with foster families. They were the Blackwood orphans, marked by a past they could not articulate. Daniel, the boy Alistair rescued from the sacrificial altar, suffered from debilitating night terrors for the rest of his short life. He died in a sanitarium at the age of 22 from what was officially called a weak heart. Sarah, the girl who saw the Shadow Man, never spoke a full sentence again. She communicated through gestures and drawings, disturbing, abstract sketches of dark figures and hungry trees. The other 2 children lived quiet, isolated lives, forever detached from the world around them, their spirits permanently broken by their time in Mercy Hollow. They were the living casualties of the matron's war, proof that the unburdening she practiced destroyed its victims in more ways than one. It didn't just take their lives, it stole their souls, leaving behind empty shells, a living testament to the evil that had been allowed to fester unchecked on that lonely Missouri bluff. Their muted suffering was the final, chilling legacy of the orphanage where no child lived to see 10. Decades passed, the world changed. Wars were fought, technologies advanced, and the story of the Blackwood home faded from memory into forgotten history. The sealed file containing the matron's journals gathered dust in a state archive, a ticking time bomb of forbidden knowledge. In the 1970s, a fire broke out in the archive building. It was a tragic accident that destroyed thousands of historical documents and cold case files. The official inventory of destroyed items listed the Blackwood Orphanage file among them. The only written proof of the cult, the rituals, and the wider conspiracy was gone, turned to ash. Whether this fire was truly an accident or a deliberate act of destruction by a hidden hand is impossible to know. It is, however, a convenient coincidence for an organization that thrives on secrecy and operates in the shadows. With the journals gone, the story was now completely untethered from fact, relegated forever to the realm of rumor and speculation. The truth of what happened was reduced to the scattered memories of a dying generation in a small Ozark town, and the fragmented, dismissed notes of a long-dead, obsessive doctor. The eternal bloom, if it still existed, had achieved the perfect crime, not just the murder of dozens of children, but the complete and total erasure of its own history. The cold case was now permanently frozen, its secrets sealed not by law, but by fire and time. Let us return for a moment to that central, horrifying question. Why? What was the ultimate purpose of this decades-long campaign of ritual sacrifice? The fragments of the journals that Alistair Finch decoded before their destruction offer a chilling, if incomplete, answer. The Ancient One, or the Shadow Man, was not a god in the traditional sense. The cult did not worship it out of love or fear, but out of a sense of cosmic necessity. Their texts described it as a balancing force, a chthonic entity whose hunger, if sated, maintained the natural order of the world. But if it was left to starve, it would awaken, and its awakening would bring about a silent, creeping decay. Not a fiery apocalypse, but a slow unraveling of the world. Crops would fail, mines would sour, plagues would sweep the land. The cult saw themselves not as monsters, but as humanity's secret saviors. They were the grim gardeners tending to the roots of reality, pruning the blooms of childhood to prevent the entire forest from dying. It's a philosophy so alien, so profoundly inverted from our own morality, that it is almost impossible to comprehend. They believed that the sacrifice of a few dozen innocents was a small price to pay for the continued existence of the world. In their own minds, they were the ultimate heroes, performing the most difficult, most necessary, and most forbidden of tasks. The evil of the Blackwood home was not born of malice, but of a terrifying, absolute conviction. Today, the bluff overlooking Mercy Hollow is part of a state forest. The foundations of the orphanage are still there, a collapsed and vine-choked scar of stone, barely visible amongst the dense undergrowth. The field of 47 crosses has long since been reclaimed by the woods. The wooden markers rotted into the soil, the small depressions smoothed over by a century of rain and fallen leaves. There is no plaque, no memorial, no sign that this tranquil spot was once the site of such unimaginable horror. Yet the land remembers. Hikers and hunters who wander into the area unaware of its history report a strange and unsettling feeling. A sudden unnatural cold, even on the hottest summer day. A profound sense of being watched from the trees. the feeling of a deep, ancient sorrow that seems to rise from the earth itself. Some claim to hear the faint, disembodied sound of a child's cough or a woman's low chant carried on the wind. Most dismiss it as their imagination, the natural creepiness of a dense, isolated forest. But those who know the legend, who know the forbidden history of what took place here, they understand. It is the echo of the past, a psychic stain left behind by years of concentrated terror and suffering. The curse of the Blackwood home is not gone. It is simply soaked into the land, becoming a permanent, silent feature of the landscape. The case remains officially closed, but unofficially it is a specter that haunts the dark corners of law enforcement history. It is the cold case that is too cold to touch, too disturbing to reopen. The questions it leaves behind are as chilling as the events themselves. Was the fire that destroyed the journals an accident? Are there other gardens still in operation, hidden in the forgotten pockets of the country, tended by other caretakers? Is the Shadow Man a unique entity tied to the Ozark bluff, or does every garden have its own shepherd? The horrifying implication of the matron's journals is that this was not the end of a story, but merely the interruption of one chapter. The network of the Eternal Bloom, if it ever existed, was designed to withstand the loss of a single operative. The great work, as they called it, would continue. It raises a final, deeply disturbing thought. If a horror of this magnitude could operate undetected for 20 years in the early 20th century, what could a similar organization, armed with modern technology and methods of deception, be capable of today? The silence of the historical record is not an assurance of safety. Sometimes it is the sound of a predator that has learned to hunt more quietly. The story of the Blackwood home for foundlings is a chilling lesson in the nature of evil. It shows us that the most profound horrors are often not the product of sudden, violent madness, but of a slow, deliberate, and reasoned philosophy. Matron Blackwood was not a raving lunatic. She was a true believer, and that is a far more terrifying prospect. Her evil was methodical, patient, and cloaked in the comforting guise of charity and faith. She exploited a community's trust, the system's indifference, and the landscape's isolation to carry out a macabre, forbidden practice for 2 decades. This case serves as a dark reminder that the most monstrous acts in human history are often justified by those who commit them as necessary, even noble. It is a testament to the terrifying power of belief, and how the conviction of righteousness can lead a soul down a path to unimaginable darkness. The line between a savior and a monster is sometimes only a matter of perspective, and in Mercy Hollow that line was not just blurred, it was erased completely, swallowed by the cold, hungry earth. The ultimate horror of the Blackwood home is not that it happened, but that it made a terrible, twisted kind of sense to the people who were doing it. In the end, we are left with nothing but shadows and whispers. The truth of what happened in the Missouri Ozarks of 1910 is lost, fractured into 1,000 pieces of folklore, speculation, and redacted files. The orphanage is gone, the perpetrators are dead, and the victims are nameless dust. The case is cold not just because of the passage of time, but because its very core is a void, an absence of answers, of justice, of understanding. We can sift through the ashes, we can listen to the legends, we can try to piece together the motives of a long-dead cult, but we can never truly know the full extent of the horror. The final, unsettling truth is that some secrets are not meant to be uncovered. Some darkness is so absolute that it defies the light of inquiry. The story of the orphanage where no child lived to 10 has become a permanent part of America's forbidden history. A chilling, unresolved mystery that reminds us that beneath the placid surface of our world, there are older, darker things that slumber, and we can only pray they are never awakened.